Hey there, how's it going? So I just had a thought. I'm reading through this book, Star Trek History and Pictures, and I'm reading through the part about Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and they're talking about Harv Bennett and how they brought him on the team, and was not familiar with Star Trek very much. So they say he'd never watched an episode of the original Star Trek. He immediately sat down and watched all 79 episodes. And as some work paid off, he became intrigued with Khan, Nooney, and Singh in Space Seed, and he came up with the core for the story of The Wrath of Khan. But I had a brainwave as I was reading that. I thought it was so interesting. Just picturing this non-Trekkie going through all of Star Trek, and then he sees Space Seed, and he sees Kirk setting these people off and running off to leave them, so then I jotted down this note. Star Trek has always been a sort of inner conversation, hasn't it? Continually conversing back and forth within itself about various topics. If Star Trek the Motion Picture was kind of a response or a yes and to the themes in Where No Man Has Gone Before, because in Where No Man Has Gone Before, a man becomes a god and is like, well, this can't be good. This is going to be bad because there's bad stuff inside humanity. And then TMP is kind of a response to that, kind of like a, well, yes and to that concept, because then we have if we had a man become a god in this way, well, that would be the answer to all the problems in the world. So if TMP was sort of a yes and to the themes in the No Man story, well, then Star Trek II is very much a response or a yes and to the conclusion of Space Seed. Because it's kind of like Harv Bennett, who wasn't familiar with Star Trek. He's watching through, and I have no idea what he actually experienced, but I'm just picturing him watching through and seeing all these times that Kirk leaves some people off in some planet and just does this thing and then leaves, and is like, wow, is this really a responsible, great future utopian way of handling things? Here's how I put it in my note that I jotted down when I had the thought. I said, because Harv Bennett apparently noticed the ludicrous ending, which Kirk often does at the end of an episode, and then rather than complaining about it or becoming a hater, instead he created a story out of it. Instead of saying, no, stupid, instead he says, yes, and showed so much love for the good parts of that episode while giving those weak spots a little bit of a swat. So much so that Star Trek II became not just wildly successful as a film in its own right, but became one of the most immortalized and chiseled in stone, so to speak, of all the classic Star Trek stories. Even though at root, the premise is basically an eyebrow-raising corrective, or if you prefer, a playful rejoinder pushing back in the midst of conversation to the weaknesses or differences of opinion of prior Star Trek. And maybe this is part of what makes the franchise so strong. Kind of like the ideal of academic publication, like if you read an academic journal or something like that, and it's trying to be a conversation with multiple points of view. Maybe this is part of what makes the franchise so strong. Kind of like the ideal of academic publication, Star Trek ends up being a fairly broad conversation, constantly saying yes and within itself as the conversation goes on. Or occasionally, and oh, really? Or the occasional, I didn't hear that, moving on, But this conversation, so that in the end, what you've got in your hands is not univocal. It's not the purified, continuous repetition of only one opinion, but is actually instead one great, fascinating, interconnecting, and often self-challenging conversation. So that was my little thought as I was reading through that book there, and I just had the thought, this is a conversation. And I think that's what the franchise is. And then, of course, to add to that, I was thinking, after I wrote that note, I was thinking it's also a conversation in the sense that there's not just responding within the franchise. It's not just Harv Bennett responding to whoever wrote Space Seed, but they're also responding to stuff on the outside. So if I talked about how TMP was basically Where No Man Has Gone Before, kind of responding back to that. Of course, it's also responding back to the 2001 Space Odyssey film. You could say it's kind of responding back with a little bit of a pushback to the story in the No Man, or not necessarily a pushback, but like yes and in the sense of, okay, well, let's look at this side where it looks a little different, but it's definitely a conversation. But anyway, so if they're responding with a little bit of a, to the No Man story, well, at the same time, they're responding back by mirroring the 2001 Space Odyssey story. It's almost like they're responding back by resisting a little bit to this one and nuancing it with the information they're kind of just mirroring back. Oh, we love this. Let's repeat this from 2001 Space Odyssey. And in the same way, whereas the Wrath of Khan story is responding back, pushing back a little bit to the irresponsible ideal or the kind of unrealistic optimism of the way Space Seed had ended, They're also responding back. So it's completely separate things. They're also responding back to uh, the in 1979 Alien film, trying to figure out what word to use to describe it, because it's not a theme; it's more just a taste or an appeal. They put in the parasite, which isn't necessarily part of the thematic point of the film. I don't think I have to watch it again and analyze it to see if I think it really ties in, or if it's just I'm kind of thinking of it more as just kind of the coloring or the stuff that's put in there for general appeal. But anyway, so it's responding to Space Seed. It's also in conversation with Alien. And then, so if the first level of conversation is that the franchise itself, the episodes and the films are all in conversation, responding back and building on and even pushing back sometimes to things that are said within the franchise. And then it's also in conversation with the films on the outside, which people like me who are so into Trek may not even be aware of some of the things that Star Trek is responding to in the larger world of film and television and stuff like that. And of course, also responding back in conversation with academic things and things in culture and all this kind of stuff. But then the third level of conversation for me, when I think about Star Trek as a conversation, is of course the fan world. That the fans, whatever level of fandom they are, or if they're just people casually aware of Star Trek, then they, people like me, end up having conversations about the conversations of Star Trek. So at the end of the day, Star Trek's just conversation, conversation, conversation. Well, for myself, I think it's kind of cool. Anyway, that's my thought.